The black line signifies that something is happening on Greenland. Whether it will happen again next year, we don't know. One of the questions that people don't like to talk about, and Jim Hansen's the only person I've ever found who's prepared to say this, is what would happen? Could Greenland survive if we have sea ice-free conditions? And he says no. As I said before, the tipping point has been revised down from 3 degrees to 1.5 degrees, and the paleoclimate record shows that Greenland formed at less than 400 parts per million, and we're past that now. So Greenland will take time to melt. I'm just saying, we now, I think in the last couple of years, understand that we have created the circumstances where Greenland is really vulnerable. Whether we pass a tipping point is a bit of academic exercise, because you only know if you pass the tipping point in retrospect. Wisdom in hindsight. This is a figure from Jim Hansen on, over time, the amount of ice mass lost, the amount of melting on Greenland. The satellites, which are supposed to measure this, haven't been up there for long enough, and he says it will take another 10 years to know how quickly Greenland's melting. He just makes the point that the green line, or perhaps the red line, which are exponential lines, that is that each period the amount of doubling, the amount of melt doubles. So if it's a red line, it means the doubling is melting every 5 years. If it's a green line, it's 10 years. He said, we don't know, but he's having a lot of argument for a lot of other people, saying he thinks it's probably 10 years or closer. But he's just put other things saying that if it's a 10-year doubling time, that every 10 years the amount of ice is lost is double, that would lead to a 1 metre sea level rise by 2067 and 5 metres by 2090. Now, as you know, the Australian government, it's speculation, but I think it's sort of a bit informed. Work at the end of last year, a lot of Antarctica is not warming, but West Antarctica is the most vulnerable. They just did a whole lot of work and said it's one of the fastest warming places on the planet, so there is a part of West Antarctica which is vulnerable as well. So the Australian government has a policy that we plan for sea level rises of 1.1 metre by 2100. That's the most that we do, no more. This is our risk management, 1.1 metre. The United States government, through the Department of Commerce and the NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, at the end of last year brought out 4 new scenarios for America on sea level rises, ways to think about planning for sea level rise. And the top one is 2 degrees, is 2 metres. So Australia's starting to look a bit shoddy. So they think 2 metres by 2100. In fact, the US Army Corps of Engineers, who are responsible for the Mississippi and the New Orleans levees, amongst other things, have just come out and also said a credible upper bound for 21st century sea level rise would not exceed 2 metres. We're now planning at Fisherman's Bend to put 60,000 people on there, and there's a whole lot of sea level rise maps done by the City of Port Phillip and Melbourne Water, where they have a sea level rise of 0.8 metres, not 2, 0.8 metres by sea surges, and that shows about a third of that Fisherman's Bend area underwater in a 1 in a 100-year event. And they're a metre and a half under where they need to be. So if anybody's got a planning BNF on it, there's a really good issue there. There's a big report from UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, on permafrost at the end of last year. I'm not going to talk about it because there's a lot of speculation, and if it all goes, it'll be very bad, but no, it will go, and I don't think the work has been done yet. To conclude all this Arctic stuff, I wrote a piece last year called, which was published in Joe Romm's Climate Progress, called "As the System Changes, We Must" of the science. And I think that's the really important lesson, that the Arctic in 2012 means we have to go back and look at the assumptions and the predictions about what's happening. Because, to be honest, what's happening in the real world is ahead of a lot of what the scientists and their models and their papers are saying. And it's been that way for a while. And that is really disturbing. I mean, Ross Garner made the point in his second report. He said, given a range of scientific papers, observations, the real world should be somewhere in the middle of all the papers. He said, when the observations are all at one edge of the papers, rather than in the middle of the spectrum, it tells you something. And I think that was a really important point that he made. The last thing is that because the jet stream is wobbling, we've seen record rains in Europe, record cold. We just talked to in France, says it's rained every day this year and hasn't stopped raining for months and months in Paris. And you know there's been floods again in Europe. There were those extreme cold snaps in US last year. And Superstorm Sandy was in fact magnified by a destabilising of the jet stream. So the jet stream keeps the Arctic cold and the subarctic temperate systems a little bit separate. I'm not a climate scientist, I understand it particularly well, but that's what it's supposed to do. And there's peer-reviewed work out saying it's now starting to wobble because of the loss of sea ice and a lot more energy coming into it. So two things are happening. Cold out of the Arctic is being brought down into Europe and North America periodically. So this real cold that the deniers go on about, how come there's global warming if we had record snowstorms in New York? I mean, this is actually the reason, and the reverse, of course, is more heat's going into the Arctic, and it may have an influence on this incredible US drought as well. So here's just a couple of people, the American government, the first guy saying, the jet stream is breaking down, resulting in warmer than average Arctic region and colder temperatures that may include severe winter weather on the North American and European continents. And down the bottom, a peer-reviewed paper, an increased probability of extreme weather events that result from prolonged conditions such as drought, flooding, cold spells and heat waves. So the Arctic, what starts in the Arctic doesn't stop there. Okay, let's briefly talk about Australia. You know what we've had. We've had fires and floods, and then we had this incredible series of events earlier this year where large numbers of records were smashed, extraordinary. And then we had some pretty amazing rain, particularly we live in Bundaberg, where people after the last flood lifted their houses up a metre, and some of those houses got flooded into the second story this time. And places west of, just west of the Gold Coast that had 1,450 millimetres in 4 days. That's 25, 35 inches of rain. What's Melbourne's average? 400? Somebody tell me?
Was during the droughts
600. So about 2.5 years of yearly rain in 4 days. Extraordinary events. And in the first 14 days of January, 70% of the land area of Australia experienced a day of 42 or more. Extraordinary visual story. If you're going to talk to friends and relatives who don't want to know about climate change, don't give them words, just give them pictures. Print out a few of them. They tell stories. Little slight diversion. Trying to bring this back together. If we get to 4 degrees, and you know with climate change, it's the average, it's not the day that matters, it's the extremes that matter. We see now it's when the extreme fire, extreme heat, extreme precipitation, they're the events that really question where and how we can live. It's not the months in, the months out, it's those extreme events. So a piece of work was done. A T100 event is a 1 in 100 year event. And you can make a lot of money betting at the moment on the number of places in Australia that have had a 1 in 100 year flood at least twice in the last 5 years. A lot of money. Because in fact 1 in 100 year events will become 1 in 10 year events and 1 in 5. That's what more extreme weather means. But they said if you got to 4 degrees, this is just models being run out, if you had a 4 degree warmer world, what would an extreme temperature be? What would a 1 in 100 year event mean? And here's Australia, that nice red colour, and they said temperature extremes around 50 degrees in large parts of the area, the area equator to 30 degrees, that is in between the two tropics. Projected T100 values far exceed 40 degrees in southern Europe, the US, Midwest by 2090, and even reach 50 degrees in northeastern India and most of Australia. So at 4 degrees or more, most of Australia would experience days of 50 degrees or more. And I mean, I think we have to think what Black Saturday did at 47 to think that it wouldn't be real flash. So these extreme weather events are really valuable for those of us who are committed and concerned to communicate climate. The word climate and extreme is something we should just put together all the time. Politics is the art of timing. Trying to convince people that climate change is real mightn't work when it's a nice temperate day. After Black Saturday, in the United States, after Sandy, after a number of events there, concern and support for the idea that climate change was real and human cause started to kick up again, noticeably, because people understand extreme climate as being indicative of climate change. So I just think there's some words we need to look at here. Julia Gillard did what MPs hadn't done before, and not a very good formulation, but she actually said, yes, there is a relationship between this heat and climate change. Amazing. Actually said it once or twice. Then she talked about when she went out to the western New South Wales, landscape to moonscape, a perfect storm. Somebody obviously written these words for her. She's not capable of them herself. Compare this to the Victorian fires and the Queensland floods, where the premiers and the government, state and federal at the time, refused to make any connection between those events and climate change, and where the Victorian Royal Commission into the fires deliberately excluded climate change from its consideration. So in that sense, I think something has shifted, and it's something these teachable moments are really, really important to us, because people are listening when these events are on. And David Caroli, I don't know whether he actually wishes he said it, who works in this building, at the 2009 4 Degrees conference in Europe, talking about fires in Victoria, and he says Victoria is probably the most vulnerable place in the world to increased fire risk caused by climate change. A, because of the drying, the less precipitation, the increased temperatures, but also of course we've got eucalypts, and you know what eucalypts do. And he told the conference in 2009, in terms of fire, we're unleashing hell on Australia, which is pretty good language from a climate scientist. I'm not sure it's peer reviewed, but it sort of gets the message across. So just when we're talking about this, I think it's really important not to go, oh look, there's no real connection between this event and climate change, but you know, it says somewhere. Jeff Masters from Weather Underground, really worth reading all the time. The climate has shifted to a new state. I think it's really important to be able to say that. The climate system is now based on a platform that's a degree warmer, 0.8 degree warmer than it was 100 years ago. So it is a different state. It's not like normal and odd things happen. We've actually changed the platform on which the climate happens. And again, the extreme events that happen at the boundaries of what are possible, what people tend to notice, when the climate changes, those boundaries change. So all the time we are seeing the boundaries. You know, the fires that were 190 on a rating system that was supposed to stop at 100. The boundaries are changing. I think that's language that can really work for us. Kevin Trenberth, who's fairly forthright, it's not the right question to ask if this or that storm is global warming. There's always an element of both. There is a systematic influence on all of these weather events these days. And I think it's really important we keep on saying that. This is systematic change. It's not Julia Gillard, you can't really make a connection. We can make a connection because the system has changed. David Crowley makes the same point. Okay. I was going to talk about what we should say in sort of connecting the dots, because I think connecting the dots between extreme weather and climate change is really important to us, because it allows to make that dim distant future, or climate change won't affect me, it'll be my grandkids, it's 100 years away, it's halfway around the world. These extreme events allow us to say it's here and it's now, and these events will get more frequent We are actually, these extreme events are climate change, and they will get more frequent. So it's not 50 or 100 years' time, it's now. And I think it's really important in investing we say that it's now, not the future. Okay, a little bit of politics sort of to finish. This is a slide I got out of the archive when I spoke at the first Grassroots Climate Summit in Canberra in 2009. And I put this slide saying the 2-degree consensus has ended, the politics heads towards 3 or 4 degrees, the science heads towards 0 or 1. And people sort of scratch their heads because everybody's talking about 2 degrees and it was pre-Copenhagen and, you know, we're all going to have 2 degrees and be happy clappy and have a nice deal and the world was going to be saved. So what's now happened is that people have actually stopped talking about 2 degrees. Sorry, some people, like the climate advisor of the British government, says it's no longer possible, which is really helpful. And instead they're talking about heading towards 4 degrees. And then talking about whether you can adapt to 4 degrees, which is clearly a ludicrous proposition. So there's what I call the giving up paradigm, which you see in international politics quite a bit. What isn't said is that 2 degrees is also a disaster, that we can get back to a safe climate and it will take extraordinary measures. This is what is said, this is what isn't said, because it's a bit challenging. David Roberts, I don't know if anybody reads David Roberts on Grist, really wonderful climate writer. He put it in his talk last year. 2 degrees is almost certainly too high to be safe and too low to be possible, Parrott doing it. 4 degrees is hell on earth, and by 2100 with 4 degrees we'd have this. And Kevin Anderson, the most forthright academic writing in the world in my humble opinion and well worth watching, says a 4-degree future is incompatible with an organised global community. And I think that's really important to understand. So, can we avoid this? The answer is yes, we can. Whoops, we are missing something here. Missing a picture, it doesn't matter. Jim Hansen put out some work last year saying if you want to get under 350 parts per million, what you've got to do is reduce global emissions by about 6% a year, and you've got to do a certain amount of drawdown, whether by reforestation or large-scale char or whatever. But he put figures out. And Shellam Huber, when he was out here with the 4 degrees conference, says that you know, if you start now, a 2-degree scenario is about 4% a year global reductions. I mean, which are not impossible to do if you have the will. So all those people who say this is not possible is just what they mean. It's not politically convenient, because it is really possible. But Kevin Anderson makes the point that if you delay, it gets more difficult, and because you really actually have to go to zero, that little red box I think is really important. He says, because we actually have to get to zero, not halfway there, there is no space for coal, gas, shale or CCS. I think that's a really important point. It is zero, it's not replacing one fossil fuel with another. It just won't work that way. I think that's a really important lesson. Okay. So 4 degrees, the question is, are we heading over a cliff? And there's a whole lot of people whom you might have read. Jorgen Yanders, one of the authors of the Club of Rome report, Paul Gilding. Who's read Paul Gilding's book? Should. Good. Really good read. Really good read. Graham Turner from CSIRO. Paul Ehrlich has got a long essay out. A whole lot of people saying, yes, we are. Rander's book, Paul Gilding's book, The Great Disruption, Graham Turner's stuff from CSIRO, in which he says the Club of Rome report, which is now 40 years old in 2012, he went back and looked at all the predictions in the Club of Rome report and said basically that report was right. Everybody poo-pooed it, said, oh, we're not going to run out, no oil, no sustainability problem, but in fact it turned out to be true. So, for example, the Club of Rome originally, and this was reproduced last year, had this scenario where things started to hit the fan about 2020, 2030. And it still seems to be so. Graham Turner from CSIRO, and you know how much trouble people at CSIRO have trouble getting published and saying things which are provocative. I mean, there is the Chinese bureaucracy has got nothing on the CSIRO bureaucracy in terms of having people. I am serious. Well, like the Cambridge bureaucracy in the case of poor Peter Wadhams. And Graham Turner's review of 40 years of Club of Rome as against the data of 40 years says a 40-year-old model and forecasts of the economic and environment system that many had relegated to the dustbin of history appears to be standing the test of time well. The insights and messages of limits to growth stand as a warning of potential global collapse, perhaps more imminent than generally recognised. So that's a CSIRO scientist saying that. And the reasons, I'm sure most of you who work in sustainability around this area know, growth can't last forever. The degradation of the system and of the ecosystem, the depletion of non-renewable resources, the fact we're using up 1.5 years worth of resources every year at the moment. The Club of Rome and its key insight was that as resources run down, they're increasing cost of extraction. You're seeing this with oil already, for example, in Saudi Arabia. They're increasing cost of extraction, and you have to apply more and more capital investment to get the same amount of stuff out. And that, in the end, actually starves the rest of the economy because you spend more and more of your capital keeping the energy system going. That is, a fossil fuel energy system going. The impacts on water, food, and so on. Until you get to what they called overshoot and collapse. What Randers and Paul Gilding and so on call overshoot and collapse. And so the obvious point is that changes in behaviour and technology are both required. And behaviour, I think we could say politics, society, culture, they use the word behaviour. The choice is collapsed or managed decline. The choice is letting the system run until it actually collapses, or managed decline. That is the new solutions, the sort of things that BZE talks about, that allows us to get out of this paradigm of consuming resources and fossil fuels until there are none left, into a different paradigm. But the problems they point out is that there is an implementation delay because all decisions are made in a context. And if we look at coal in Australia, for example, we know what that context is, and the context affects the decisions. So, just to finish, our context is the post-war growth and prosperity paradigm. It's all about the economy. It's all about the economy. More growth, more jobs, more growth, more of everything until there's nothing left. So it's what Randers calls the happiness via continued economic growth based on fossil fuels paradigm. Sound familiar? Which is what we have in a modern deregulated capitalist society based on the following propositions: that markets are efficient, that democratic governments are self-correcting, and that there is a general benefit based on increasing affluence. I mean, also the crumbs off the table theory. And increased global public welfare through globalisation and trade. That is the Industrial Revolution paradigm. But in a world of systemic uncertainty, overconsumption, social isolation, the biggest health epidemic of the 21st century in Australia is going to be depression. Yep. And a multi-system crisis. So it is a climate crisis. It's also an energy crisis. I mean, I think there is also a democratic crisis, to be honest, and several others. And so people like Kevin Anderson last year, in a very forthright essay in Nature, said scientists, have not been talking about the elephant in the room. And so the context we have is the need for action at what Philip and I called it emergency speed. Time is short. I mean, the time is shorter now than it was 5 years ago when we wrote that book. There is a chance for a better world. I have no doubt of that. This is absolutely within our power, our technological, our social capacity to do it. But it is a choice in a way between two dystopias. The idea that, I mean, Garnaut and Stern said, let's go for 550 parts per million because 450 is too disruptive. There are some disruptions which will be necessary now, or we face a case of escalating disruption. So these are not painless choices, which is why I think the society and the politics actually can't deal with it, because these are difficult choices. And a whole lot of scientists have been saying the right thing. In fact, one of the notable things in 2012 is a number of scientists who have stood up. I won't talk about that. What should we do? I wrote a series of pieces in the middle of last year called A Sober Assessment of Our Situation, where I tried to talk about some of the issues that I thought were important to us. What should we do? I talked about them there, I listed them there. I won't do it again, and just leave you with the words of I don't know whether the age is wise, it's sometimes wise while it's still there, and of the UN Secretary General. I think what the last year has shown in the Arctic and in many places is things are changing much more quickly than we expected, but the challenge is still the same, and that's to recognise that in the present political mode we will not succeed, but that is not because the technology, the choices aren't there, it's a lack of political will. Thanks very much. Sure. Maybe take 3 or 4 and I'll answer them so I don't talk too much. I mean, take several questions or comments together. Yep. Yeah. Okay, in terms of reforestation, if you want to have a look at the Global Carbon Project, which was the first 7 slides I showed on emissions, just go look up Global Carbon Project under Google, and they show emissions, carbon emissions from deforestation around the world, and they're probably about 10 or 15% of total emissions at the moment. I haven't got the slide with me, but they are significant. In terms of oil and shale gas and so on, I mean, I think the most exciting thing happening at the moment is in Australia, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland, in terms of fossil fuels, is the incredible movement against coal seam gas. I've just been up in northern New South Wales, just engaging communities in wonderful, wonderful ways. And the same with the coal movement and the Sunrise Project. I think there's a real groundswell, and I hope it had a really powerful effect. Jonathan Moylan's little trick against the bank the other day, I think there was an explosion of activism around coal and coal seam gas. I mean, they're talking about extracting coal seam gas under metropolitan Sydney. One of the most politically stupid things you could ever want to do. And in terms of the United States, I mean, there's a bit of a cargo cult about shale. I mean, there's a story yesterday saying, look at some data from coal seam gas wells in the United States, and in the second year, I don't know if anybody else saw this, the output was lower than the first year. And now they're talking about having to put in more capital to keep the wells going. They're having really rapidly diminishing returns. So I think there is a bit, I think there's a slight cargo cult element around that. With oil from shale, yes, that's one of the reasons why America's importing less oil, but the cost of extraction get really high, and it's that problem that the Club of Rome people talked about, that the proportion of the energy you get from the extraction that you have to put in getting it out becomes a larger and larger proportion. So rather than going from originally oil under 5%, with shale oil I think we're talking between a third and a half in some cases of the energy out is actually cost of extraction, which really changes the economics of it. In terms of Hans's question, yes, I think the growth paradigm is certainly an element in the room, maybe the biggest one. I mean, that's why I spent some time about those people. We cannot go on like this. the system will crash and burn. Having read that stuff over and over again, I mean, we're absolutely on the limits now. I mean, our rates of extinction are 1,000 times the background level at the moment because of our intrusion on nature. I mean, we are at the edge, I think, of systemic breakdown in terms of ecosystems and in terms of our own society. I mean, the banking system, the national economy most ecosystems, I think, are well off compared to the banking system in terms of their resilience. I think there are a number of systemic crises that I don't want to be conspiratorial and say 1916, no, look, in 2016 there'll be a big bang, but I think they are all building, and there don't seem to be ways of resolving them within the political paradigm that we have. Sorry, I wish it wasn't true. Extreme days. David Caroli, I think those quotes says, evidence of increasing trends in extremes, reductions in coals. What it means for Australian summer is increased frequency, so more events and more extreme events. So the answer is both. Yeah. Well, that's the man who lives up here. On communications, I think to many people in Australia, stand up. I mean, people like Bob Brown have for a long time, Clive Hamilton, Paul Gilding, a lot of people more eloquent and more public than me. I really think they are around. I think people are intimidated, partly because they get a denier or two in the room, and they get really anxious that they're going to, end up in a fist fight. I think the deniers are actually it's probably one of the most, have actually put off people speaking and doing stuff in public because of the fear that they engender. And I think that's really sad. There's a wonderful mob called Skeptical Science who even have a little app with all the deniers things answered. So if you want to go out speaking and you're worried about deniers, just have an iPad open on the Skeptical Science app. You'll get an answer to any question in 3 seconds. On optimism and pessimism, the Sustainable Living Festival is actually having a debate on Friday of next week. I haven't given a plug for it. They have a debate each year as part of the festival Friday night next week. I don't have the details. Somebody else might have. I'm on the panel with 5 others, including Bob Brown and Tanya Hoyer and so on.